Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. The Gauteng Muslim Shura Council invites you to a Back to Basics series, a commentary on the poem Nadhm al-Akhdari, a Maliki Fiqh masterpiece by Sīdī Abdulqādir Mandla Nkosi. Session 13.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Hamdan yuwafi ni'amahu wa yukafi'u mazidah. اللهم صل وسلم بجميع الشؤون في الظهور والبطون على من منه شقت الأسرار وانفلقت الأنوار نبينا وحبيبنا محمد سيد الأبرار وعلى آله الأخيار وأصحابه والتابعين ومن تلا. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا الكتاب والحكمة وانفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. An interesting question has reached us. He says, is it by mistake that you read جاء أحدكم instead of جاء أحدكم? I make a lot of mistakes and I pray that Allah overlooks them, but this is definitely not one of them. And what you have mentioned, both readings are correct. جاء أحدكم or جاء أحدكم. The latter is the common reading in this part of the universe. جاء أحدكم. It's probably what the questioner is familiar with. And the riwayah of Imam Hafs and Asim radiyallahu anhuma. As for جاء أحدكم, with a slight pull, Imam Warsh and Imam Qunbul makes tasheel and ibdal in the second Hamza. And I'm assuming the questioner understands those terms since he seems like a person with a Qiraat background. And this is what is summarized by Imam Shatibi in his Qasida. الأخرى كمد عند ورش وقنبل وقد قيل محض المد عنها تبدل. Now, the next question, does a person have to untie her braids when making ghusl? No, a sister does not have to untie her braids. It's not an obligation at all when making ghusl. And this is also the view of the other madhahib as well to a high extent. Imam Muslim related that Salama asked Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam about untying her braids when making ghusl for janaba. He sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam said, لا إنما يكفيك أن تحفي على رأسك ثلاث حثيات. No, it suffices that you spread or dispense water on your head thrice. And by braids, we are merely talking about what is permissible, like ugluga with your own hair or wool. As most of you already know, there seems to be a heavy injunction when it comes to extending hair using other human hair. Now, we are reading from page 33. قال المصنف شيخ عبد الله الشنقيطي الحيض. Al-Hayd, the linguistic meaning of Al-Hayd is flow. In Sharia, Al-Hayd is the blood that emanates or comes out by itself from a female's genital at certain intervals, regular or irregular. And this is what is commonly known as periods or menstruation. And the definition, the ulama always include the fact that it is blood that comes out binafsihi, by itself. And this excludes blood that comes out due to illness or anything like that. And this also excludes minors or very old women. So if blood comes out of a 5-year-old child, it's not considered menstruation. And the same goes for an elderly woman who's way past the childbearing age. And with us, the Malikis, even if it's just a drop of blood, the periods have started. Contrary to the Hanafis and the Shafis, who give it a day or so to confirm if it's really hayd, menstrual blood or not. With us, a drop is sufficient to confirm al-hayd. This chapter is important and more relevant to our beloved mothers, sisters and daughters. However, it's also good for husbands to know. And I have to say that I have found a lot of sisters in ultimate darkness when it comes to the rules pertaining to menstruation. And men are to be blamed for such ignorance. The current setting makes it very difficult for sisters to actively learn their deen. And I think the Muslim men believe in a man's world more than James Brown did. So there are many masajids, mosques around the country, yet only a handful of them cater for the spiritual needs of our sisters. And due to the extreme nature of the measures in place to ensure that man remains the boss, which of course has absolutely nothing to do with Islam. It's just some cultural baggage tainted with misunderstood Quranic verses and hadith. And inevitably, some sisters, while trying to voice out and raise their concerns, they unfortunately fly past moderation themselves and land on the other extreme. And also part of their negligence of these Islamic sciences, I guess they're just tired of having to stomach some of these male chauvinistic interpretations. And the catchword is interpretation, not necessarily the spirit of Islam. Contrary to the propagated ethos, Islamic knowledge is just as important for females as it is for males. And at the peak of this importance are the individual obligations that every Muslim, male or female, should learn and master and implement, like purification and salah, for example. So this chapter, no woman can do without. And always remember that negligence regarding purification is negligence regarding salah. And negligence regarding salah, prayer, is wretchedness and a peak of darkness. Salama radiallahu anha once asked Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa wasallam a somewhat embarrassing question, that what if a woman has a wet dream? And before she asked the question, she remarked, Inna Allah la yastahi min al-haq. Allah does not shy away from the truth. From this, the ulama have concluded that la haya fi talab al-ilm. There is absolutely no modesty or shyness when it comes to seeking knowledge. Amekhloni or iskam, as it said, strateni, should never be a hindrance or pull anyone back when it comes to learning the deen or asking about unusual Islamic matters, for lack of a better word. Beyond any shadow of doubt, modesty is a praiseworthy trait, but not when it's detrimental to your akhirah, your next life. In general, two types of people will never acquire knowledge. A person who is shy to ask questions, or a mutakabbir, a proud, arrogant person who is satisfied with him or herself. Now, sisters, pay attention, and husbands too, with bang and ropi. Before we dive into the poem, let us go through some introductory notes. Now, sisters, with regards to menstruation, are divided into three. Al-Mubtada, a first-timer or a beginner. This is a sister who experiences menstrual cycles for the very first time. She's still getting used to the biological changes. And the second sister, Al-Mu'tada, an accustomed or habituated sister. This is a sister who has already determined her periods. And she knows her usual number of days that she experiences her periods. However, this category, Al-Mu'tada, the ones who are accustomed or habituated, is further divided into two. Al-Mu'tada, an accustomed sister who has a set or regular number of days every month, and it never changes. So she knows she's always on her periods for 6 days every month, for example. Then we have Al-Mu'tada, a lady whose number of days vary. Meaning, in some months she goes on her periods for 5 days, for example, and in other months she goes on periods for 8 days. And lastly, on the division of women who experience periods is Al-Hamil, a pregnant lady. Though most ladies don't experience periods while pregnant, some do, so there are rulings pertaining to those who do. Now, the poet begins by saying, وَأَكْثَرُ الْحَيْدُ لِلذَّالِ ابْتِدَاء أَقَلُّ طَهْرٍ نِصْفُ شَهْرٍ أَبَدًا. The maximum menstrual duration for a first-timer will always be 15 days, during which she does not perform rituals. Now, the longest duration for a female who has never experienced menstruation before is 15 days. It should never exceed 15 days if blood flows continuously. Regardless of whether the blood is still coming out or not, on the 16th day, she wakes up, she makes ghusl, prays and fast if it's Ramadan. The blood coming out on the 16th day is not considered menses with us. It's known as al-istihada. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam said, إِنَّمَا ذَلِكَ عِرْقٌ وَلَيْسَ بِالْحَيْضَةِ. This is nothing but blood from the veins, and it's not menstrual blood. The poet carries on to say, وَأَكْثَرُ الْعَادَةِ لِلْمُعْتَادَةِ وَاسْتَظْهَرُ إِنْ زَادَ بِالثَّلَاثَةِ. And the longest duration for al-mu'tada, an accustomed woman, is what she is used to, but if it continues to bleed, she only adds 3 days. Now, a lady who has experienced periods before and she knows her usual duration, for example, she usually has periods for 7 days. If for some reason when she wakes up on the 8th day and there's still blood, وَاسْتَظْهَرَتْ إِنْ زَادَ بِالثَّلَاثَةِ, she is allowed to add 3 days as a clearing out or waiting phase. So she will still consider the blood on the 8th, the 9th and the 10th as part of her periods. And on the 11th day, she makes ghusl and pray. But remember, we said in this category, al-mu'tada, an accustomed lady, we have 2 types. What we just mentioned now is in relation to a lady who has a set number of days every month. Now, what about a lady who has a varying number of days? Meaning sometimes it's 5 days and sometimes it's 8 days. So she has a minimum and a maximum number of days. Now this lady, when she wakes up on the 6th, bearing in mind that her minimum is 5 days, and she finds blood, she does not add 3 days yet. She will carry on with her periods until her usual maximum, which is 8 in this scenario. And if she finds blood on the 9th, now she starts adding the 3 days for clearing out. So she only adds 3 days to her maximum, not her minimum. Remember that. However, this adding of 3 days has a condition. The poet says, مَا لَمْ يُجَاوِزْ حَدَّ, as long as it does not exceed the limit, which is 15 days. This is the condition. She will add 3 more days as a waiting or clearing out phase, as long as this addition does not exceed 15 days. Remember, the maximum duration that a lady can go on her periods in the madhab is only 15 days. So if she's usually on periods for 12 days, for example, and when she wakes up on the 13th day, she still has blood, she can still add 3 more days, meaning the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th will be her addition. However, if her usual duration is 13 days, for example, on the 14th she finds blood. Now, in this case, she can only add 2 days. Why? Because if she adds 3 days, she will exceed the 15 days, which is the longest limit set for beginner and an accustomed lady. And our poet carries on to say, وَاسْتَكْثِرْ لِلْحَامِلِ بَعْدَ ثَلَاثَةِ أَشْهُرٍ. An increase of the set limit for a pregnant lady only begins after 3 months, complete 3 months. Now a pregnant lady will also stick to the 15 days limit until she completes 3 months of her pregnancy. After 3 months of her pregnancy, meaning the beginning of the 4th month, she's now given a new limit, which is 20 يوما, that is 20 days. ثم بعد 6 شهرا. After 6 full months, the limit becomes 30 days. Now after 6 months of her pregnancy, from the beginning of the 7th month, her new limit is now 30 days. And the poet says, وَمَا تَقَطُّعِ لَفَّقَتْ أَيَّامَهُ حَتَّى تُتِمَّ الْعَادَةِ بَادِئًا أَوْ حَامِلًا أَوْ مُعْتَادًا. Now, sometimes the periods get very confusing, like the blood stopping earlier than usual, and usually sisters get confused by this. So let's present a practical scenario to help explain this part. If a sister usually goes on her periods for 7 days, for example, but on the 5th day, she realizes that the bleeding has stopped. So in reality, she was only on her periods for 4 days instead of her usual 7. What now? Does she wait for the 7th day even though there's no blood? No. She makes ghusl and prays, carries on with her business, and fasts if it's Ramadan. And if the blood returns after 4 days of her purity, for example, she will continue her count, adding on to the initial 4 days she already did, aiming to reach her usual 7-day theory. And when the periods return but go beyond her usual, she goes back to the basics, which is adding 3 days, after which she makes ghusl and prays. But the adding and combining the 2 sets of periods is only applicable if the periods return or continued in less than 15 days, meaning she only adds if the time frame between the stopping and the starting of her menses is less than 15 days. But if periods only return after 15 days, she will have to consider this cycle as completely new periods, starting her count from day 1. Mawani al-hayd wal-nifas, things which menstruation or postnatal bleeding prevents. Now, nifas is the blood that comes out after giving birth. وَأَكْثَرُ النِّفَاسِ سِتُّونَ. The longest postnatal bleeding period is 60 days. That is if blood flows continuously. Because فَإِنْ قُطِعَ قَبْلَهَا فَغَسْلُهَا قَمِنْ. If it stops before 60 days, she should perform ghusl accordingly. So she doesn't wait for 60 days. If the postnatal bleeding stops, she makes ghusl and she starts praying. And the poet says, وَلَوْ بِاللَّحْظَةِ, even if it's instantly after giving birth. وَحَيْثُ عَاوَدَ بَعْدَ أَقَلِّ الطُّهْرِ, when the bleeding resumes thereafter, meaning after it has stopped, kana mubtada, the standard 15-day limit becomes the basis of her count once again. Meaning she goes back to the basics of menstruation, of which 15 days is the maximum limit. So it's not nifas anymore, it's considered her usual periods now. وَقَبْلَهُ لُفِّقَ لِلنِّفَاسِ, and before such time, for a bleeding woman, both due to periods or postnatal bleeding, وَمَنَعَ عَنِ الطَّوَافِ, it is impermissible for her to perform tawaf. And we have mentioned before in another hadith, الطَّوَافُ بِالْبَيْتِ الصَّلَاةِ. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, the ritual walking around the Kaaba is a prayer, إِلَّا أَنَّكُمْ تَتَكَلَّمُونَ فِيهِ, except that you can talk while doing it. And the next thing that a lady in her periods or postnatal bleeding cannot do, مَعْ مِسَاسِ كَالْمُصْحَفٍ دُونَ الْقِرَاءَةِ, touching the mushaf, the Quran, but not its recitation. So with us, a sister in her periods is not allowed to touch the mushaf, a copy of the Quran, but she can recite it from memory if she wants. وَلَا تَدُخُلُوا مَسْجِدًا, she does not enter a masjid. And we have already explained what is meant by masjid or mosque. So a sister should not enter it unless there's a pressing need. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam said, لا أحل المسجد للحائض ولا جنوب. A lady who is in her periods or a person who just had sexual relations should not enter a masjid. وَصَوْمًا حَضَلًا, nor does she deliberately fast. And if she fasts deliberately, intentionally, it's just a waste of time. And the poet says, وَقَضَتَاهُ, and she makes up missed fast that she missed while on her periods or due to postnatal bleeding during the month of Ramadan. وَلَا صَلَاةَ مُدَّةً, but she does not have to repeat or pay back her missed prayers. The wife of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, al-Mu'mineen, Aisha Siddiqa bint Siddiq radiyallahu anha said, كنا نحيض على عهد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. When we were in our periods in the time of Rasulullah صلى الله عليه وسلم, ثم نطهر, as soon as we were purified, فيأمرنا بقضاء الصوم, he used to command us to make up our missed fast, ولا يأمرون بقضاء الصلاة, and he wouldn't command us to make up our salah. والوط بين سر وركبة, it is also forbidden to play between her navel and her knees. She and her man, husband, should avoid any play or intimacy that may lead to intercourse. حَتَّى تَطَّهَّرَا بِمَا, until she has purified herself with water. And the poet says, intabih, so be cautious, be warned. وَيَجِدَا مَا يَتَطَهَّرَانِ بِهِ, nothing should happen until both of them find water to purify themselves with. In closure, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْمَحِيضِ. When they ask you about menstruation, قُلْ هُوَ أَذَى. Say, O Muhammad, it is uncomfortable and offensive. فَاعْتَزِلُوا النِّسَاءَ فِي الْمَحِيضِ. So keep away from women, but what is meant is keep away from sexual relations while she is in her periods. And it doesn't mean keep away from the beds or houses and that she can't cook and wash clothes. Leave your ZCC tendencies out of this deen. وَلَا تَقَرَبُوهُنَّ حَتَّى يَطْهُرْنَ. And do not approach them until they have purified themselves. فَإِذَا تَطَهَّرْنَ فَأْتُوهُنَّ مِنْ حَيْثُ أَمَرَكُمُ اللَّهُ. And when they have cleansed themselves, enter into them as Allah has commanded you. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ التَّوَّابِينَ وَيُحِبُّ الْمُتَطَهِّرِينَ. Indeed, Allah loves those who constantly repent and turn towards Him remorsefully, and He loves those who purify themselves. May Allah make us amongst those. And this brings us to the end of all things related to purification.